I just started recording.
Excellent.
Okay, so book three of Aristotle's Politics, but first we were going to talk about something from book one,
Correct.
namely his views on slavery and I guess
Yeah.
kind of like equality.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you want to head that up?
I can try.
Okay. Okay.
So I guess I'll try to summarize what he says, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong or address it.
Yeah. Well, or yeah.
So, so Aristotle in book one talks about slaves, and he talks about the fact that basically what basically the power that's over them of their master is in their best interest,
Mhm.
even if they don't necessarily agree with it,
Yeah.
and that it's kind of it's like by their nature that they ought to be slaves, and I don't know. It's an interesting point of view. I don't know how much I agree with it or how true it is. I feel like there are definitely
Sure.
aspects of it that are true. I also remember him talking about this idea of an unnatural versus natural slave. I don't remember exactly
Mhm.
what details he got into there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and he posed on the topic of gender that men and women are superior in different ways.
Mhm.
Like men in commanding and women in I don't remember exactly what the word he was using. I feel like it was submitting, but I feel like it was something different than that.
Yeah.
Um, so basic,
Yeah. He with the male and female, he uses the language of like superior, inferior,
right.
um, and there'll be some parallels between. Actually, there'd be parallels between his view on women, his view on slaves, and then basically other people who are ineligible for
Right.
full citizenship.
Hmm.
There's a lack, as he sees it.
Right.
Um, so here's a couple things to think about
Hmm.
on the slavery bit. And I was able to poke around a bit on Tuesday when I was a little bit more lucid after the surgery
Hmm.
um, online. And a couple things came up that I thought were interesting. One is that it's interesting that he even addresses it because it was so widespread that um, you could imagine someone not even addressing it because it was so common. So that he addresses it is even initially of interest.
Hmm.
Um, and also the how he addresses it in terms of how he opens up with it um, is also of interest because he doesn't just come in with his view. He starts out by saying there are those that say X about slavery, and there are others who say Y about slavery,
Hmm.
and he sets up this sort of like observer position, observing these two imaginary interlocutors, you know, and their views, as it were, on slavery. Which, according to one commentator, he thinks that he pretty much runs that throughout his discourse on slavery and never actually gives his final position. I don't
Okay.
know if I agree with that. But one take is that he's sort of carefully um, dealing with a controversial subject without really stating his view,
Hmm.
um, which is interesting. My own sort of take on it is that he does do that because when he does introduce it, he does do this like he sets up this argument like people say this, other people say that, but he does seem to make this argument about how within the individual person, which by the way, it sounded very platonic, within the individual person, there are passions, and those passions need to be restricted. Those passions need to be ruled, essentially by reason. And therefore, there's already a slavish part within the individual. And in a very Aristotelian way, he wants to move from that. So what's true in the individual is going to be sort of true in reality as humans relate to each other. There will be some that, just like there are parts of me that need to be ruled, there are parts of the world that need to be ruled. So I feel like he does come down on this notion a bit, but at least I would give him credit for, like these other commentators said, raising the question, having us think about it, and developing at least some sketch of his own thought. By the way, he's, in terms of the sketchy element without the total clarity, because Aristotle's pretty clear in a lot of areas, in what we've read in other areas, right?
Yeah.
But he, you asked last week why books 1 and 3, right?
Yep.
He doesn't give the ideal regime until 7.
Really?
This was research I had done. But every commentator on 7 argues that he's really sketchy about it. I mean, he's got some specifics, but it's not nearly as laid out, for instance, with Plato's ideal city. So I could imagine him doing some sketchy work, intentionally, maybe without really saying. Like maybe today we would end up saying after like a few paragraphs, and I don't have a conclusion right now. More research is required. He never says that. But I can imagine him being somewhat, sketchy. If he's sketchy in one area, I could see him being sketchy in another area as well. But it's seemingly the reason why, I mean, other than this, starting from the individual, right, and then going to the group. The other reason, basically, is that essentially there are some people that can't think for themselves.
Right.
There's some people that just can't. Yeah, go on.
So I think something that's interesting about the difference between Plato's view of this topic and Aristotle's is like Plato kind of, I mean, he didn't talk about it a lot, but he kind of mentioned this idea between Greeks and barbarians and just like, hey, we're superior, they're inferior, didn't kind of say much else about that. Like, we have culture, and that's better. Whereas Aristotle's kind of saying there's something about the individual, like by their nature, that they are a certain way. And some people might not be capable of ruling over themselves in a way that's best for themselves. Something more along the lines of that.
Yeah, you can almost sort of think like a child, right?
Yeah.
So a child we would probably admit at some level, and it would probably have a tricky time determining that transition point. But a 5-year-old maybe shouldn't be a full citizen with voting rights. So and you could point to whatever reasoning capacity at that point. And so one could imagine that type of category within Apollos, and then the question becomes what other members fall into that category, right? But the other thing that comes up in 3 and in other things that I read is that not everyone is going to be able to be the virtuous citizen.
Sure. Yep.
And I don't know if you were able to read the New York Times piece.
Yeah.
But the term inegalitarianism, I think, is very apt. He is not, egalitarian across the board. That there are those. It's going to be. I don't want to say a few, but there will be citizens, and there will be citizens that are able to realize the virtuous life. But it won't be all the residents within the city. He even says this in book 3 when he talks about manual laborers. They just won't. They're getting the work done. They won't. And part of the problem is they don't have. In order to be the virtuous citizen, you have to have leisure time. In order to pursue carry that over, then this is going to be another one of those situations where, with slaves, then whatever the rationale is, this is going to be part of that group that just will not realize their um, full virtuous potential.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, and we include women in that as well, or Aristotle includes women in that as well.
Right.
One thing I did know, it's sort of interesting, in his will, so just anecdotally, he actually specified that his slaves should be freed upon his death, which was interesting.
Upon
So
the
who
owner's
knows?
death?
No, this is just for Aristotle. So he had slaves,
Oh,
and he specified in his will that they be freed upon his own death.
gotcha.
Um, so who knows what reasoning was going on at that point?
Yeah.
Um, so, but the other take on this is that the reasoning is flawed, and he's basically picking up the zeitgeist of all the economies of the Greek city-states resting on slavery. So it's everywhere, and then he does one of these shoddy arguments
Mm-hmm.
to justify it. Like that's another take. That's not really looking at the argument, um, but it's sort of explaining why he would take that position.
Right. Well, I feel like I think we discussed before Aristotle is I forget the word right now. I don't know why it's not coming to me. Um, the word anecdotal comes to me, but that's not the one. It starts with an E.
Yeah,
What is it?
yeah. Egalitarian?
No,
No.
the one where based on facts of the world, like
Oh, yeah,
scientific
empirical.
empirical. Thank you.
Empirical.
Yeah, he has a much more empirical mindset than like Plato.
Sure. Oh my
Um,
gosh. He had three too,
yeah,
right?
so he's really extracting things from his environment. So
Totally.
the arguments that he's making could just be like, hey, this is what's happening, and I'm explaining what's happening around me.
I think you're absolutely. I think that's totally fair.
Yeah.
Totally, because he does that. I mean, he does that in three. I read somewhere too that apparently he had, given his empiricism, he had. We hadn't talked about this before, but all of his writings obviously are very different from Plato's. There's no dialogue format, right? They're all like sort of lecture styles. So
Hmm.
when he started his own school after Plato, so Plato had his academy, and then Aristotle broke off and started his own school. All his pupils were actually writing out his lectures. And
Hmm.
that's what we have. So that's why they tend to be very dry, um, compared to like the interesting dialogue format. But apparently, and this was sort of my extra reading on the slavery bit, he had sent out um, a lot of his students to study, well, not the slavery bit, but on the politics, to study other constitutions
Hmm.
in different Greek city-states and to draw those notes back to him. Um, so basically doing research for him so he could draw certain conclusions about uh, present day real world politics,
Yeah,
which is interesting. It matches the empirical bent.
definitely.
So, all right. So we jump to three.
Sure. So I did not take notes on 3. I read it and I
That's fine.
watched a couple videos
That's
on
fine.
it. So I
Got
won't.
you. And it was a little long.
Yeah. So if you
I
could
felt like
kind
it was
of
longer versus.
guide the
Yeah.
discussion,
Yeah.
that would be
Sure.
better.
Sure. And then you could jump in.
Yeah.
So within book three, we've got the first like question of like who is the citizen, right?
Hmm.
And one interesting sort of contrast between sort of being an American citizen versus being a citizen in Aristotle is that for Aristotle, it's a type of activity. And we found this already with Aristotle's approach to uh, sort of a city. What makes a city is ultimately a partnership. So these are sort of different notions than we're used to, right?
Hmm.
Whereas what makes a nation, we talked about last week, what makes a nation is for us anyway, a type of constitution, a literal like
Yes.
constitution with written laws, etc. So he's also doing sort of a flip here because for us, we would probably say that it's more of a legal question, right? Are you born in the United States? Were you born to American citizens abroad? Then you
Right.
are a citizen by law.
Hmm.
But that approach is not his. um, uh, his is more like it's this particular activity, and as he says in 1275A22, the citizen is in I'm sorry, the citizen in an unqualified sense is defined by no other thing so much as by sharing in decision and office. So it's this um, it's the ability to deliberate. It's the ability to make decisions. It's the ability to employ your reason. Um, and by the way, if you take those qualities and put it back on the slave is lacking, according to him, those traits. Doesn't have the reasoning capacity, and therefore can't deliberate to ultimately determine what the right thing to do is,
Hmm.
right? Um, so this was really, I don't know, there's part of this that I really liked because there's so, I mean, I have to say like my sort of political involvement in comparison to a lot of other people has been pretty low,
Right.
and um, and yet I still consider myself a citizen, the United States. But if just simply sort of reading the news and talking about it with, you know, select people has been what I've been doing, I'd probably be failing Aristotle's test, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I, and also too, I feel like this, if this were like really part of um, our political culture, it seems like you'd have more reason to participate, right? This is expected of you, and yeah, you'd want to sort of dive in. So I like this element
Yeah.
um, of sort of being politically involved in what sort of makes you a citizen.
Right. What's interesting is, so you'd mentioned that children don't necessarily um, have the same sort of ability to rule over themselves as adults. What's interesting is on this topic about citizenship is he puts underage and overage people into a category um, where they don't have that discernment. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right, he used the word superannuated. I don't remember. I don't know the actual definition of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obsolete through age. There you
Look
go.
at okay. So
Um,
just clarify for me.
so you're talking about like what it means to be a citizen, and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
like that's being knowledgeable. That's having control over the political
Mm-hmm.
field. But it's interesting that he puts people who are too old, out of the picture, kind of
Yeah,
as someone who
that's
has
interesting.
that power. Um,
Yeah,
Now, how you
that's
define that,
interesting. Yeah.
what you mean by like who's too old, or like does it mean that you have
Mm-hmm.
medical problems, or
Sure.
those are all questions that you'd have to answer. But it's interesting that it's like the threshold is on both ends of the spectrum to a degree.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's not
That's
like
no. I
just
totally
because
agree.
you're a person you can vote and that kind of stuff. It's like there are
Exactly.
qualities that are required to be a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
And
there's
it's
even
interesting. Yeah, go on.
part of his discussion where he's talking about hereditary, like citizenship is
Mm-hmm.
is hereditary to a degree. Um, when I was reading that, I wasn't sure if he was talking which direction in the generations. Like, is
Sure.
he talking about children or is he talking about ancestors? Um, but that was one of the aspects that he was explaining in that too.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excuse me, that I think is very, very interesting. I feel like I sort of missed that part about the ends of the spectrum. I know with children, but I think I missed it
Hmm.
on the older end. And I'm just like looking through my notes here. Yeah, I think I just sort of missed that. But it seems to be, I mean, it seems to be at least consistent, regardless of, I mean, it seems to be, consistent with what he's saying.
Yeah.
Um, the, whatever that ideal center is, of, the individuals, well, it's going to end up being, because I poked around book 7 a bit, landed uh, male citizens that are going to have that are going to be more the full citizens, right?
Interesting. Which
Um,
is very different from
and
Socrates and
oh,
Plato.
very exactly. Here's something that I was like kicking myself about, because as I was reading some summaries of the other books, he tears Plato's ideal city apart in book 2.
Really?
So it might be the case that down the road, if we ever want to revisit, we'll just revisit the entire book.
Hmm.
Yeah, apparently he actually like rips it apart, and part of it is because of the communism, of everything being held in common and things like that.
Right.
Um, and I went, because it was book 7 and it was more of a summary, I didn't really get the rationale behind the landed part.
Hmm.
Um, we would probably just have to extrapolate, like why.
Yeah.
Uh, Here, you need the hold on, Christian. You need the
Okay.
code thing. Okay, I'm on the call with him, so you have to hand this right back to me. Okay. There it is. Scroll up. Okay. QR code.
Um. Okay. So, what was I thinking? Trying to think of where he kind of went from the idea of the citizenship. Wasn't there something? Oh, yeah. Um, he started talking about like how well citizens interact with rulers. He started talking about good citizens and wise citizens.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is kind of where the idea of citizenship groups into a government, right? Where
Right.
the political being interacts with the level above, right, from his first chapter.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and again, um, this is shoot, my brain. Uh,
Mine as well.
what was the word again? Dang it.
Empirical.
Empirical. There you go.
Yeah.
I was using that fine last
Okay.
week. Okay,
Yeah.
it's very empirical. So he states that the wise citizens are typically fewer than
Yep.
like the rest, and
Mm-hmm.
this so it would be unfair for like a few wise citizens to rule over the rest. I think is kind of what he was
Right.
getting at, which is
Mm-hmm.
which is well, one that's different than the philosopher king because that's a single wise person ruling over,
Yeah.
and it's also against like the oligarchic state. Now,
Mm-hmm.
not those aren't necessarily wise, but those would be rich. Um, so he's exploring kind of the different governments that were discussed um,
Yes. Oh gosh. Yeah.
in
In the
Socrates,
Republic.
yeah, in the
Yeah.
Republic. But from a different kind of point of view, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the big one when he does that was I thought was really interesting in terms of getting a handle on his critique
Hmm.
and his the flow of his argument was the basically the problem is, are you ruling from your own interest or are you ruling in the interest of all the citizens,
Hmm.
right? So all of the, at least the translation I had, perverted forms were ruling in their own interest,
Right.
right? and so what I would say was interesting is that there's a similarity between Aristotle and Plato, and their ideal regime is a common good.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The one of the critiques that I read in summary form that Aristotle had, though, is that there's so much emphasis, or too much emphasis, placed on unity within Plato's regime. So, in other words, like I guess by unity, it's sort of all these pieces working in their own place, right? But in an ordered way, and
Right.
doing all these things like the education and the censorship to
Yeah.
maintain that order. I think Aristotle had a bit of an issue with that, but you still have a common good, right? You
Mm-hmm.
just like you you the and possibly too, it's going to be the case because ruling for your self interest for him is just not rational, or it wouldn't pass the, as it were, the virtue test
Mm-hmm.
of looking at a telos and looking at an action and which action is going to be the better. It's going to fall into one of the vices
Yes.
ultimately
Right.
of excess or deficiency. So it's in other words, you can't do that. It's illogical and it's literally vicious. You
Mm-hmm.
know.
I think one of the reasons why, well, like, I guess one of the differences because Plato's perfect state was so perfect. Everything just worked the way that
Mm-hmm.
it was because of how he set it up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there's not a lot that can be applied to real life from it,
Mm-hmm.
because we are so imperfect. And I feel like
Yeah,
Aristotle's kind of trying to address that fact.
yeah.
So it's
I think you're right.
it's more empirical. It's more like, hey, this is real stuff that we're dealing with. Um, but also,
Exactly.
yeah.
What also?
But also, shoot, what are we talking about?
It started off with the how both Plato and Aristotle were looking at the similar regimes.
Yes. So I think what I was going to say was, oh, yeah, you had mentioned the vices, which is
Yeah.
evidenced in his ethics, but
Right.
I think you can notice it a lot in his politics too. It's like,
Yeah.
you want to find that mean between the two vices,
Mm-hmm.
in the extremes of government, and you can see that he's not for like democracy, like pure democracy,
Yeah.
and he's not
Totally.
for like oligarchy, like rule of a
Mm-hmm.
few, but instead he wants something that is a mix of the two. And we didn't
Yeah.
read chapter 4, but I saw a summary that was kind of like mixed 3 and 4, and they used the term polity, which is
Yeah.
the combination of the two essentially. And it
Mm-hmm.
it reflects very closely kind of the government that we have now. Of course, there's aspects of it that are different, but I just thought that that was a very interesting thing, knowing
That's
the
wild.
vices and the means.
That's pretty wild. I'm curious if you could tease out what would be an oligarchic democracy in terms related to what we've been reading in Aristotle,
So what?
right? Because you were saying it would be sort of a combination, like the
Yes,
polity would be a combination.
right. So Aristotle recognizes that the few that are rich or wise,
Mm-hmm.
have a
Mm-hmm.
say in or should have a say in the government. But he
Right.
also reasons that the many should have a say in the government.
Right.
So I don't remember the exact way that, like, I didn't read the chapter, but I just kind of read the summary. So I
No, I
don't
get it.
remember the exact way that they interact with one another, but it's essentially Oh, okay. So actually, I remembered something. Um, so because you have these two groups, you can't say that there's going to be one ruling the other. You can't say that they can just easily cooperate with one another,
Right.
which is where this idea of constitution comes in. It's like we have to have this
Mm-hmm.
structure that supports this government. So instead of being
Mm-hmm.
ruled by people, it's ruled like there's the structure around the people who are ruling. So that's a very important element to the polity. And yes, I think so. Essentially, I don't know exactly how it would work, but I think, it's
Sure.
similar to our democratic republic in the U.S., where we elect representatives, but I think what would be different is some of those representatives would be wealthy by nature, and others would be from the many by nature.
Hmm.
I think
My
British
one
Parliament does
issue.
something similar to
Yeah. Go on.
this. Maybe
Hmm.
I don't know their political system very well, but I think in the article I was reading, they that the original intent of the British Parliament was under this kind of view.
That's cool. That's interesting.
Hmm.
My one issue with at least a full endorsement um, of by Aristotle of a democratic republic would be the idea of electing others to represent. Because if because I think that the if we're so in other words, I can see that there might be similarities, but the one big difference would be a higher expectation of what more, I don't want to say full, but more participation, political participation by the rest of the citizens who are voting them in, right,
Hmm.
than we presently have. Because what we presently have, like at least, well, I don't know if I want to say by law or the present channels we have,
Hmm.
is by voting and jury duty.
Yep.
And possibly, I mean, I don't really know that this is, I was going to say military, but that's only if you sort of work your way up in it, you know. And I'm sorry, yeah, and then running for office, right?
Right.
So that would be my one issue that um, there might be some similarities. But the one issue would be the rest of those full citizens that are voting the representatives in need to be doing more deliberative work and more political involvement than we see American citizens doing on
Yeah.
average.
Hmm. I
Um,
think that's true.
I mean, I did take that. Oh, that's funny that you did four because I didn't do four. In terms of a summary, but it'll be interesting when we look at my notes for seven about how the sort of oligarchic democracy fits in
Hmm.
with sort of a sketchy ideal state.
Gotcha.
You know,
Yeah, because I think, Aristotle recognizes that it's important for the citizens to have political involvement.
yeah,
Um, but I think he also recognizes that democracy is not the best way to do that. Although
yeah,
there
yeah.
are some parts of this book in book three. I don't remember exactly where, but where he talked about like the idea that rule by many, um, while there may be a few, like there may be there's like this idea of extracting kind of the best parts of all of them to a degree.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but there is also the idea that they may make mistakes as a group,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is I think where the Constitution kind of takes that role. It's that should
Hmm.
smooth out
Hmm.
those mistakes.
Yes, exactly. And um, I'm saying exactly to the Constitution language, specifically, at least the translation I have. See, the translation I have uses Constitution at times in place of the polity term, and
Hmm.
then other things that I read were using polity. But if by Constitution you mean law, you're absolutely right.
Hmm.
Because in let's see, he's the one. Well, yeah, it's 1287 A28. He says, "One who asks the law to rule, therefore, is held to be asking God and intellect alone to rule, while one who asks man as the beast desires
Yes.
a thing of the sort, and spiritedness perverts rulers and the best men." So your passion.
Hmm.
Hence, law is a great line. Law is intellect without appetite.
Yes.
So you could totally see how law can be sort of this corrective to whatever majority rule.
Yes. And I think you said the
Um,
word appetite. I think passion is also used.
yep, yep, exactly.
So the law removes
Yeah.
that sort of that motive, that
I,
passion.
I just thought, yeah, I thought it was really interesting, you
Hmm.
know. I mean, my one issue, and this would be my issue with the Supreme Court and also the nominee that's up for the Supreme Court now, is my it's not. I want it not to be a political thing. I want it to be a philosophical thing or a theory thing,
Hmm.
and that is to say that it it is tricky. I don't think texts always speak for themselves. So I remember as I was becoming more, I don't know, aware or
Mm.
critical of my early religious upbringing, where we would like point to something in the Bible and proof text it and say it's sort of there, that there's a lot more going on than just the text speaking for itself.
Sure,
So
and we saw that
there's,
when we were reading about structuralism. It's like you can't just take a
yeah,
text out of its context and understand it.
exactly. And this becomes really tricky because, and again, this relates to the Supreme Court. We'll have fun with that when we get to the documents in the spring. This relates to even what he's saying here, that he's totally right about like law, intellect without appetite. I get that, but the because it's sort of, I'm trying to think of like the good analogy for it, but um, it's stable, it's concrete, it's seemingly unchanging.
Hmm.
But the fact that you have people involved and that you have and that there's an interpretive element, I think that's where this sort of gap is created in it not speaking for itself in so many words, right? Where you have to do some level of interpreting it. And you're selecting, and that was always sort of the interesting thing too, with proof texting. Why are you selecting that? And isn't the act of selecting it even somewhat, um, I don't want to say biased, but it's a choice, right? You're selecting that and not that, and that says something about that, the, sort of the process of, um, or the role of interpretation in the act of pointing to a text or to a law, you know.
Hmm.
So theoretically, I get it. In practice, I think it becomes really tricky, you know. Um, and I mean, even like with the lady that's up for the Supreme Court right now, and all the talk about sort of being an originalist and a textualist, it totally like it you know props on being able to um, state your position. Um, but with the originalist perspective, there's this notion that you are actually able, and this seems to me a big task, to understand the framers' intentions in writing the law. That's I think that's expecting a lot,
Hmm.
you know, and uh, and not impossible. And it's not to say that you can't, maybe have like 12 separate people study, the intentions of the founders separately, and then they all come back in a year and they come to some agreement. I think that's possible, but I do think that it opens up some other, problems in interpreting things as well.
Sure.
Um, so, but yeah, the law bit I really like. Sort of, it's just a corrective, you know.
Hmm. You mentioned the shoot. The word, the exact, you mentioned, so the Supreme Court,
Originalist or
no, 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 like interpretation, interpreting the
yeah,
law, right?
yeah.
And it made me think about, I think it was part of book three, I think it was later in in the book, where Aristotle talked about the idea of a state as like what is a state, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
he compared it to that of a river. It's like it's not about the water particles that are moving in the river. It's
Oh, I
kind of
remember that.
the general structure of it, right? So it just made me think of
Right,
that. It's like
right.
there's this ebb and flow in government and in our
Hmm.
nation, but the nation remains the same. Um,
Yeah.
and things about the river change, things about the nation change, and what that change is. I mean, is it for the best of the body? Um, that's what you'd hope.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're. Yeah, I remember that. I remember that section. Um, so so yeah, we're both working with tired brains here,
Yeah.
but we're doing the best
Hmm.
that we can given the circumstances. Just looking through. Um, let's see. I'll be honest. I had a little bit of trouble on the whole section about um, sort of the good citizen versus the good man, and um, how like whether or not they can be the same. You know,
Right. Yeah.
did you got you? I mean, remember that it's like
I.
there's only I think that there was it was like there's only one situation in which the virtue of the good citizen, excellent man are the same, and this is when the citizens are living in a city that is under the ideal regime. So, which we don't get in this book.
Right.
Um, we only we yeah. So in other words, like all the other regimes that he talks about, it looks like you're only well. See, I don't know if this is true, but it seems like if I work from that statement, then you're only going to get good citizens, but you're not in those regimes, but you're not going to get good men.
Hmm.
Um, so, like in other words, you can have a good citizen in an oligarchy. You can have a good citizen in democracy, um, because of the nature of that partnership, right? Based on wealth, based on the many, so on and so forth. But so yeah, you could you know what I'm saying? Like you throw the citizen in there, it will be good if it is abiding by the rules of that particular partnership, right?
Right.
Which is the foundation of that kind of regime.
Right.
Um, or another way of putting it is they become a good citizen in there because they're following the laws of that regime.
Hmm.
But the maybe it's not too hard to understand. You're not going to get the good man or the virtuous person because you're not in the ideal regime, right? There's some because all those regimes to some degree are flawed,
Right.
you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. So I guess in if you were to look at Socrates's
Oh, here's the
government.
if I could throw in one more thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Can I throw in one more thing? And remember, Socrates' government.
Yep.
I think this is also going to be because the other one. Remember, he's critical of the perverted regimes because they are not respecting the full freedom of the citizens. Now, keep in mind the citizens,
Hmm.
not the residents, right? Because if I'm a tyrant, I'm only interested in ruling for myself, which means I'm not respecting the freedom, let's say, slash equality of the citizens.
Right.
If I'm in an oligarchy, I am ruling according to the interest of the few wealthy, and therefore am not respecting the freedom or equality of the rest of the citizens, so on and so forth. So the fact that the citizens within the ideal regime are acting freely, right, and not slaves and not sort of quote unquote slaves to the type of perverted rule,
Hmm.
sort of connects as to why one couldn't fully be virtuous within those regimes, right? You have to be free. You have to be free to pursue uh, uh, your human flourishing, your as the Greek word eudaimonia in the ethics,
Hmm.
the final end, the greatest happiness. You have to be a free
So I think if you look at Socrates and Plato's ideal government, you see that the ruler has the best interest of all the people in mind.
Mhm.
So I wonder if good man and good citizen are the same thing in that government. Um,
Yeah.
but whereas in
Actually, you know what's
Aristotle's,
funny?
there is the kind of a separation.
Yeah.
What?
I think I feel like there is an element where you could be a good citizen, but not necessarily a virtuous person in Plato.
Yeah?
And I feel that. Like the I feel like the working class, the artisans, or the soldier class is not fully. I don't know. I feel like that's somewhere. Is not it cannot be fully realized individuals.
Well, here's the thing. I think the
But I'm
definitions of virtues are
but I
different,
also yeah.
right? Like
No, you're right.
because in Socrates' government, they all have their own purpose, and being virtuous is doing the thing that they're supposed to do, essentially.
Yeah,
Whereas in Aristotle's, he doesn't focus on all those efficiencies and everyone having to do the one skill
agreed.
art, as efficiently as possible. So he's talking about, it's more real. um, yeah.
What I was going to throw in is I remember having a puzzle when I first read the Republic, and that is to say that within the city, within the city, within the city,
Hmm.
the all of the three different classes are working together, ultimately for the virtue of the, if you will, for the common end of the city.
Yep.
But then there was this question to what degree the analogy to the individual is true of those individuals in the city. Do you know what I'm saying? So, in other words, like, um, can I, after the analogy is made, can I then take the conclusions drawn about the individual soul and project them back into the individual farmer, the individual soldier, the individual guardian, right?
Hmm.
And maybe there is no problem doing that, right? But I see what I thought was what made the artisans was that they were not driven by reason. That they were that because that right they're sort of like a base part of the city.
Yeah.
They're necessary, but they're a base part. But I'm not fully. I'm either not making myself clear, but I would say this. I'm not uh, fully resolved on that position. It could be the case that whatever conclusions are drawn about virtue and the soul can be applied to those three
Right.
castes.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, that's also another thing about the differences. It's like Plato and Socrates kind of disguise the government in the fact that there are those castes. They lie to the they lie to the people. Um,
Right.
Whereas Aristotle doesn't take that approach at all. He wants everyone to be involved in the government, and he wants the people to have like to be able to express their point of view. Um, instead of just being under whatever system is there already.
You there? Sorry, I just switched
Yeah.
from pause. Yeah.
What did you get?
Give me the last bit.
Um, so so looking at the difference between Socrates and Aristotle's governments, the citizens. So Socrates had the metals, those different castes, and basically he's projecting this lie above over all of the citizens, so that they will participate and that the state will maintain its goodness. And it's like uh, you can have something that's not good be good for the group, for the whole, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but
Totally.
Aristotle doesn't really like doesn't really like that, I guess. Or he's more focused on the fact that the citizen has their own aspect, their own role in the government, and that it should be recognized.
Yeah, it's sort of like, in other words, they both have the notion of the common good,
Mm-hmm.
but but there's a real focus on the citizens in Aristotle's regime flourishing.
Yeah.
Like that's key, and they do that through deliberative processes. They do that through political participation, but it's ultimately that they be happy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the focus seems more on the organic the, the organic whole of the city, as opposed to the happiness of. I mean, I think he even says that. Like, we're not interested in the happiness of any one individual, Socrates, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're interested in the good of the whole, like how like it's a well-run machine
Yeah.
versus the whoever the true full citizens are in Aristotle's regime are fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
And not, I mean, they're not just alive, they're not just living, right? They're living a good life, you know, as he gets it. So it's interesting. There is this sort of there's a common end, but I feel like the common end for Aristotle is for the individual constituent parts, and I'm not convinced that for Plato that's it.
Sure.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it could be the case that the soldier. Well, I don't know that you'd be miserable because you'd be doing your right work,
Yep.
your part, and you would maybe at least be happy that the whole is in fact whole,
Yeah. And that
right?
you have
And
this
not and
protection from the system.
right, but I would say it is very different on the level of human flourishing that Aristotle points to.
Yeah, I think
Some
so.
some concluding things on his ideal state from Seven, just notes I took
Mm-hmm.
from summaries. One, it is sketchy, and I read that in a number of places. He's sketchy about the structure um, and the makeup of that regime. But what I did get is that the best regime is one where the best men rule. So we've got to deal with best and men plural, right? So it is a kind of aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because the language that's used is of a great souled person, and this was there's Greek to behind this. I don't know the word, but these individuals are great souled individuals. The one like synonym they came up with was like what one would think of as sort of like a classic, urbane, cultured, well-read, well-traveled gentleman. So you have all these sort of experiences, but if you're very, but there is an element of you that is, um, uh, cultured and have a lot of breadth, but not sort of in a elitist. Well, I guess in an elitist way, but 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 not with a selfish goal in mind, but with the idea of contributing that great souledness to the city.
Okay.
Couple other traits. So that one, I have to be honest, we'd have to basically do like a word search on that Greek word to get some more clarity of it.
Does it sound different than the Philosopher King?
It sort of does because the not maybe not totally different because there is that whole idea of exposure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the different kinds of training in military music, gymnastics, music, math. There is that breadth. Um, so I think that I could see that. I could see that some similarities. Some other pieces, though, is he actually talks about the size.
The size
So
of the government?
yeah, of the city, and
Okay.
he and it's basically it's relatively small.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just to like basically. I mean, you can sort of think about this in the classic Greek notion of moderation,
Hmm.
but also uh, just you're trying to create virtuous citizens, and you're trying to do it properly and too large. It's just going to be too difficult.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that would probably be a anachronistic critique of a nation state. There were no nation states at the time,
Hmm.
but something like a small Greek city state. So like Maryland would probably be a good example. Like
Right.
that would be about as big as it would be, and then you can get the work done. The necessary part, and I mentioned this before, were leisure, leisure and intellect to participate. So in the city, in governing the city. So that's why things like slaves or laborers would not be citizens because they don't have that ability to better themselves, engage in the deliberation, and create laws, as it were, that are going to govern. You need time for that.
Hmm.
Um, and then virtue is obviously key, that yeah, every citizen needs to possess moral virtue and um, and have the ability to attain that like most perfect, excellent happiness. Property was thrown in as well. Quote: "One should call the city-state happy not by looking at a part of it, but at all of the citizens." So they need to they need to basically be able to hold political office and possess private property. Um, and I'd have to tease out the property bit a little bit more.
Hmm.
And then he concludes the book on education.
Oh yeah.
So, and that sort of is interesting because Plato does deal with that. Yeah, I think that's most of the last book. Um, and it would be a common system, a system of education for all the citizens because the end is the same. So,
Right.
so essentially, I mean, the compare and contrast would be not as detailed as Plato's, um, but um, yeah, I mean, some similarities and you know some distinct differences as well. You know, I do think it's interesting that both of them are pretty much against democracy. I mean, Aristotle less so, but still, with exceptions. But
Hmm.
um, so I think I'm out of breath.
Yeah.
Real quickly, since by the way, did you get the Augustine book yet?
No, not yet.
Oh, weird. Okay. Not sure when that was supposed to be shipped, and but yeah, certainly sooner than later.
Hmm.
Um, um, what I know I don't have a lot of time, but what do you make of the two, Plato and Aristotle, and what we've read? I know it's very open ended.
um, well, I mean, I think we've discussed this already, but um, from their points of view, Aristotle's very empirical. Socrates and Plato are very what's the word? Philosophical.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
philosophical.
Philosophical. Yes, that's the word. Or theoretical is probably a better word. Um, and I don't know. So, just kind of rough impressions. I feel like Socrates fleshes out his ideas a lot more
Uh,
than Aristotle does. Maybe that is more evidence in the fact that there is kind of that dialogue, and he gets, kind of that feedback and responds to it. Whereas
mhm.
this just kind of seems like a lecture, um,
No,
and
totally.
a bunch of stuff is just being spat out. And he does consider
Yeah,
other views, but maybe not necessarily all the ones that his interlocutors would pose.
yeah, yeah.
And you
Agreed.
mentioned like the sketchiness of some of his
Hmm.
stuff.
Yeah.
Like it's not as fleshed out,
Oh my
but
gosh. No, I mean, like Socrates basically had a position on everything.
yeah,
And if it wasn't clear the first time, or if he didn't address it fully, he went back to it.
Yep.
You
I think
know?
I think I like Socrates's way of thinking about things
Yeah,
better,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
I also recognize that it's not 100% practical for the real world.
Mhm.
um, so I think that's kind of what I get away from it.
Yeah. No, I think that's valid.
Hmm.
I it's been a while since I've read Aristotle in general, and the politics in particular. Um, but I think the one thing that's Aristotle. I mean, other than the moments of sketchiness, right?
Hmm.
He's pretty methodical. You know,
Hmm.
there is this. You can see like, you know, why he's called the father of logic from other texts, because there is this sort of like step by step by step approach.
Hmm.
I mean, Socrates does it as well, in the form of a dialogue. But it seems like he's trying to be very thorough in his approach, and I think they're just like pieces. I don't know if I can take the full system, right? But I feel like there are pieces that I like.
You're talking
I mean,
about Socrates right now?
I'm sorry, Aristotle.
Okay.
Aristotle. The so I do feel Aristotle is methodical and is covering a lot of like important basics
Hmm.
and fundamentals. Um, but I can't. I have trouble accepting the inegalitarian element.
Mm.
It's I feel like there's and part of the inegalitarian argument is based on nature, and I don't know because human nature is so flexible and um, and not necessarily determined. Um, I think there's just so much more room for any individual to grow and change and become whatever.
Right.
So the whole like it's based on nature argument I find problematic.
Hmm.
The inegalitarian from just an ethical perspective I have problems with. I
Hmm.
would want everyone to have the ability to flourish, you know. But there are pieces that I like, and I think the political, as we talked about the political participation, the recognition of the human being a political animal, or that just the language
Yep.
I really like.
Hmm.
Um, that there's something in us, as it were, that is sort of politically driven, and not to participate in that is almost somewhat of a failure. And I like to that not to say that Socrates doesn't do this, but the combination of the ethics with the politics, and utilizing this virtue ethic and incorporating it into a political theory and outlook, um, is commendable as well.
Hmm.
You know, but yeah, the inegalitarianism with slavery, with women, with the manual laborers, and sort of the only real free citizens, you know, resting on the backs of these individuals who were doing the hard labor.
Yeah.
That it doesn't seem fair to those individuals,
Yep. I
you know,
agree.
that they can't realize themselves, and what's to say if things had been different and Aristotle had not been born into his, I believe his father was a doctor, so a sort of a higher class. I mean, he could have been that slave,
Hmm.
so, given the contingencies of life. So,
Yeah. And so, um, will we be talking about the egalitarian kind of uh, what's the word? Discussions or theories down the line? Are those in the lineup?
yeah, those are going to come. I think that the more we get into the so-called modern period,
Hmm.
the more it's going to get egalitarian.
Hmm.
So you think sort of like, I mean, I'm trying to remember. I mean, Hobbes is going to be a big transition point. So Augustine's going to be our next read is going to be right at the break of the ancient world breaking into the Middle Ages, and his is going to be not the only one, but our first one that is religiously based, and but political theory comes out of it.
Hmm.
Hobbes also has some religion, or Machiavelli is not. Machiavelli, I mean, is just very ruthless and interesting to read, but very ruthless. With this very sort of realpolitik of how a ruler should rule and use every trick, good or bad, in the bag. But it's a classic
Okay.
in the genre. I want to say, come Hobbes, we're going to start to get more at the egalitarianism across the board,
Okay.
because his is the start of the so-called social contract theory.
Hmm.
And when you do that, I mean, even if they start ignoring, because it's still like whatever 1600s or something, or 1500s, even if they ignore women, let's say, the language you will see will be readily applicable, you know.
Hmm.
And then certainly as you get closer and closer to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you know,
Yeah.
the language becomes more and more egalitarian. So, um, uh, so yeah, that'll come up. I mean, there are critiques though, even of the Constitution, which I'm sure you're aware of, right?
Hmm.
All men are created equal, and when was it written, and who didn't have the vote, and what humans were considered property,
Yeah.
blah blah blah.
Hmm.
So the language, I think, will get more and more egalitarian.
Sure. Cool.
Cool, awesome, man. Well,
Yep.
one day we'll listen to the recording and see how this one came out. But given that you're tired and I'm recovering,
Yeah.
um, anyway, good talk.
Hmm.
I'm gonna just check to see the status of that shipment. I will say it was, because it was used. It came from like a secondary source,
Hmm.
but through Amazon. So not from one of their warehouses.
Right.
Um, but I'll check on that. And dude, have a good weekend.
Yeah, I
You
will.
deserve